In the sweltering heat of 1834 Louisiana, on a plantation where the air smells of sweat, mud, and sugarcane, one man works in silence. Isaiah, an enslaved brick mason, moves with quiet precision, his hands skilled and steady, his voice rarely heard, yet his mind is alive with thought and calculation. He builds walls every day, walls that rise under the weight of his labor and the oppression of his master, Ezekiel Thorne, a man whose cruelty is measured, methodical, and absolute. Thorne believes he commands everything, yet he does not see the mind behind the hands he exploits. Isaiah's silence is his shield and his strategy, a language of patience and unseen power. As whispers of rebellion drift across the southern fields, as rumors of revolt stir hope and fear alike, Isaiah conceives a plan unlike any other, a plan written not in words but in brick and mortar. This is the story of how a single enslaved man turned his skill into vengeance, how he used the very tools of his oppression to build a justice that no whip, no law, no master could prevent, a story of patience, courage, and the enduring power of silent resistance. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. In the heat of Louisiana, where the air hung heavy with the smell of cane and sweat, there was a man whose silence was as solid as the walls he built. The others called him the Silence Mason, for he spoke so rarely that even his whispers seemed uncertain in the air. Yet his hands told stories with every brick he laid, stories of precision, patience, and endurance. From dawn until dusk, Isaiah worked with mortar and stone. His movements were measured, steady, almost ritualistic. Where others cursed the sun or groaned beneath the weight of the day, Isaiah remained still within himself. The overseers came to trust him, for his walls stood longer than theirs, his lines ran straighter. They saw, in his quiet, the obedience they demanded. They never understood that silence is not the same as submission. Isaiah had learned early that words could betray him. Words could be twisted, overheard, or punished. Silence could not be whipped, could not be broken open like skin. So he guarded his voice as carefully as he placed each brick, revealing nothing but the strength of his work. The plantation stretched wide around him, its rows of sugarcane trembling in the wind, its fields marked by chains and sweat. The big house loomed above it all, painted white but rooted in red soil. Every brick Isaiah set into place became part of that structure, part of that order, yet he felt none of it belonged to him. He built a world he would never inhabit, walls that would never protect him, homes that would never welcome him. Still, there was a strange power in his craft. When Isaiah worked, he felt something beyond the lash and command. In the rhythm of stone and mortar, he found a steadiness that no master could touch. Each line he drew was perfect, each corner exact. In those moments, silence was not emptiness but design. It was a language only he spoke, a language of patience and of waiting. The others sometimes wondered about him. They laughed quietly when he walked past, saying he was born without a tongue, or that he had buried his voice in the fields where no one could find it. Isaiah let them wonder. His silence gave him shape. It made him invisible when he needed to vanish, and unforgettable when his work stood tall. Ezekiel Thorne, the master of the plantation, knew Isaiah by reputation. He called him the best mason on the land, though the praise was no gift. Thorne admired the strength of walls, but never the strength of the man who built them. He thought Isaiah's silence a mark of docility, never realizing it was the opposite. A man who builds and does not speak can wait longer than any overseer, longer than any master. As the day's labor ended and the sun sank red over the fields, Isaiah washed his hands in a basin of muddy water. His eyes remained steady. He had built another wall, strong and clean, rising against the twilight. The others drifted to their quarters, their voices tired, their laughter faint. Isaiah walked with them but spoke no word. In his silence, he carried something deeper than stone. He carried the weight of memory, of patience, of design. And though none could see it, within that silence lay the beginnings of a plan, one brick at a time. The plantation stretched like a wound across the Louisiana earth, its rows of sugarcane swaying beneath the heavy summer sky. From a distance, it looked like order, neat lines carved into the soil, the promise of wealth rising tall and green. Up close, it was a different story. The stalks cut skin as they were harvested, leaving hands bloodied. The air was thick with the grind of labor, the sound of chains dragging across dirt, the crack of whips, the dull ring of hammers against wood and stone. The ground itself seemed to breathe with suffering. Each footstep pressed into mud mixed with sweat, with blood, with the remnants of lives consumed. The scent of cane mingled with the sharp odor of iron, the sourness of bodies worked to exhaustion. The fields whispered of countless hours spent bent beneath the sun, every harvest measured not by celebration but by survival. At the center of this expanse stood the big house. Its white facade gleamed in the light, a false promise of purity. To the master it was pride, a symbol of dominance, a monument to wealth extracted from the bodies of others. To those who built it, who tended its grounds and scrubbed its floors, it was something else entirely. The big house was a fortress of cruelty, a reminder that the distance between the overseer's chair and the slave cabins was more than miles of land. It was the distance between power and despair. Around the house, smaller structures sprawled, the smokehouse, the barns, the storage sheds. Each had its purpose, each built by enslaved hands. The cabins where men, women, and children slept were narrow, crude, and crowded. Roofs leaked when the rains came, and the winter cold cut through their walls with merciless ease. Yet even in those small cabins, faint traces of life persisted. A whispered song in the night, the soft hum of a mother rocking her child. These quiet moments carved out a humanity that the plantation sought to erase. Beyond the fields, the cane gave way to swampland, to buzzing insects and still waters where the moss hung heavy from the trees. For the enslaved, these swamps carried both fear and hope. Fear of snakes, of disease, of capture, hope of hiding places, of paths that might lead to freedom if one dared the unknown. Every detail of the plantation spoke of control, of a system designed to extract and consume. The walls were built high, the fields wide, the house tall, yet beneath the surface, in the silence of those who endured, another story waited. The plantation seemed eternal, a structure rooted deep in the soil of Louisiana. But like all monuments built on cruelty, its foundations trembled, even if the tremors were too faint for the master to hear. Ezekiel Thorne was a man who carried his cruelty the way another man might carry a pocket watch, close at hand, polished, and always in use. He did not shout often, nor did he always raise the whip. His methods were quieter, colder, more precise. He understood that pain could be measured out like coin, and that fear could be drawn like mortar between bricks, binding men tighter than any chain. His fortune was carved from sugar cane, from sweat and blood, and he managed both with a steady hand. Thorne walked the fields not as a man inspecting crops, but as a lord inspecting his kingdom. His gaze swept across rows of bowed backs, and though his words were few, every glance carried weight. He could look at a man and leave him trembling, not from what he said but from what he might do. He had perfected the art of discipline without noise, breaking spirits without leaving scars. His power was a constant presence in the lives of the enslaved, like the humidity that clung to the air. It seeped into every corner of the plantation, from the cabins to the cane rows to the very walls Isaiah laid. Where others felt his presence as a heavy pressure, Isaiah felt it sharper, as though each wordless order cut against the silence he held so dearly. For Isaiah, who lived in stillness, Thorne's stillness was a mirror twisted into cruelty. The master's wealth was visible in the grand columns of the big house, in the glass shipped from New Orleans, in the silver that gleamed at his table. Yet none of it would have stood without the hands that worked unseen, the hands he refused to acknowledge. His empire was built on the backs of those he owned, yet he treated their humanity as a flaw to be corrected, as though voices and dreams were obstacles to his rule. Isaiah had known men who raged, who shouted, who lashed out blindly with anger. Thorne was more dangerous, He calculated his punishments, choosing when to withhold food, when to sell a family apart, when to watch a man collapse from exhaustion without lifting a finger to help. His silence made him unpredictable, his calmness more terrifying than fury. For Isaiah, every wall he raised on Thorne's command was another reminder of this power. He laid each brick with hands steady, yet within him the weight of his master pressed harder than the Sunday. He understood walls better than most, and he recognized that Ezekiel Thorne had built his own invisible walls, ones that trapped not only bodies but souls. And though Isaiah spoke no word, the silence within him began to harden, becoming something more than endurance. It was the seed of resistance, waiting for its time to grow. Isaiah's days were shaped by two instruments, the brick and the whip. One rested heavy in his hands, rough with dust and mortar, demanding patience and precision. The other cracked against his back, carving lines into his skin that never truly healed. The two did not belong together, yet on the plantation they were inseparable, as though creation and cruelty were bound by the same cord. When Isaiah laid brick, he felt a measure of order. Each stone had its place, each line a rhythm that steadied the chaos of the world around him. Walls rose under his touch, strong and deliberate, and for a moment he could pretend that permanence meant safety. Yet the illusion shattered each time the whip sang through the air. Its bite reminded him that even the strongest walls could not protect him from the will of another man. The overseers looked at his hands and saw only tools. They noticed the steady grip, the careful balance of weight, the skill that made his work endure longer than theirs. They did not see the scars beneath the calluses, the ridges that told of punishments endured. His hands were a ledger of his life, every line a record of labor and suffering, every scar a signature written in flesh. To Isaiah, the walls he built were more than structures. They were monuments to what had been taken. Each row of bricks felt like a row of gravestones, silent markers for voices silenced, families broken, dreams buried. The mortar that sealed them together might as well have been mixed with tears. He worked because he must, but with every wall his silence grew heavier, shaped not just by restraint but by grief. At night, when his body ached and the cabins grew quiet, Isaiah would stretch his hands before him and study them in the dim light. He traced the scars with his eyes, remembering the whip, and then turned his palms, remembering the brick. Creation and destruction lived side by side, one forced upon him, the other born from him. It was this contradiction that defined his life, and it was this contradiction that gave shape to his silence. The others whispered sometimes, saying he was blessed with skill, chosen to build. But Isaiah knew better. Skill meant nothing when it served cruelty. His walls stood tall, yet they belonged to Thorne. His silence protected him, yet it also imprisoned him. Every day was a reminder that the same hands that could raise something lasting were also bound to endure the lash. And in that truth, a quiet fire smoldered, waiting for the moment when brick and whip would no longer share the same story. Isaiah carried a language that no one else could hear, a language built not of sound but of stone, not of words but of weight and measure, while others filled the air with talk and songs. Isaiah built his sentences out of brick, each line he built dew. Laid became a phrase, each corner a punctuation, though he never spoke it aloud. His walls told a story clearer than any tongue could hold. He learned to measure the world in ways beyond the overseer's reach. When others dreamed of far horizons, Isaiah dreamed of lines straight and true, dreamed of foundations that would not crack under time or storm. He saw in every brick the memorizale, memory of hands before him, hands that had labored and bled and vanished, leaving only faint echoes in the soil. His work became a kind of testimony to their existence, a mark that they had once been here and would not be forgotten. Silence for Isaiah was not an emptiness but a design. It was the pause between strokes of a chisel, the stillness before mortar set, the quiet that gave shape to structure. In his silence he carried patience, and in that patience he carried power. For words could be twisted or beaten from a man, but silence could not be stolen. It could only grow stronger within him. As he worked, he imagined the walls as more than shelter. They could be weapons not in the way of blades or guns but in the way of truth, the way they stood unyielding against the world. Even after their maker was gone, each wall was a message. Each stone, a witness to suffering endured, and endurance itself was a form of resistance. Isaiah's silence made others uneasy. They could not tell what he thought, what he dreamed, what he might do. And so they mistook his stillness for weakness. Not knowing it was the opposite, he carried within him the weight of all he had seen and all he had built. And in that weight, there was strength. By night, as the moon spilled across the fields, Isaiah would look at the outlines of the walls he had raised and feel them speak back to him. They whispered of memory, of patience, of design. They told him that silence was not the absence of a crevasse voice but the foundation of something larger, waiting to rise when the time came. The year of 1834 was heavy with whispers. Though the masters wished to crush them flat, the words carried still, passing from mouth to mouth in the cabins, in the fields, in the shadowed corners where no overseer watched. The name of Nat Turner still burned like an ember carried across the South, a memory of revolt and of fire. Though years had passed since his stand, the thought of it gave shape to dreams that could not be silenced. Men and women bent beneath the cane spoke softly of escape. Some imagined the forests, others the swamps, a path carved through darkness toward freedom. Some spoke of fire, of turning the master's wealth into ash, of striking once and vanishing into the night. The overseers heard only fragments. The masters dismissed the danger, but the whispers endured like roots beneath the soil. Isaiah listened, though he did not answer. His silence was not ignorance, it was a vessel. He gathered the words and carried them within, yet his plan was not the same as theirs. He did not imagine fire sweeping across the fields, or a desperate run through swamp water. His silence held something slower, something heavier. A design built one thought at a time, like the walls he raised each day. At night, the cabins filled with quiet hope. The songs carried in low tones were not only prayers but maps hidden in melody, stories of men who had crossed rivers, of women who had followed stars, of children carried north on weary shoulders. Isaiah listened with steady eyes, hearing the yearning in their voices, but he knew that flight was not his path. His strength was not in running but in building, in waiting, in turning silence into shape. The masters laughed at the very idea of rebellion. They believed fear was stronger than hope. They believed chains heavier than dreams. But beneath their white house and their tall columns the earth was stirring. The air was thick with something they could not see. It traveled with every whispered word, every look exchanged in the fields, every hymn that rose into the night sky. Isaiah walked among them, his face still, his tongue still. But inside the silence grew sharper, more deliberate. While others dreamed of escape, he dreamed of walls. While others dreamed of fire, he dreamed of stone. His silence did not crush the hope around him. It guarded it. It shaped it. It waited for the moment when his own plan would meet the weight of history and speak without a sound. The order came as the sun slid high over the cane fields. Master Thorne called Isaiah to the steps of the big house, his voice clipped and low, his words heavy with command. There was to be a new chamber built inside the house itself. A storage room, he said, though his eyes shifted as he spoke, as if the word storage was too thin to cover what he intended. It was to be done quickly, quietly, with no questions asked. Isaiah bowed his head as always, but inside his silence stirred. The task was different from the walls he built in the fields, or the cabins he repaired after storms. This chamber was to be inside the heart of the house, within the very bones of Thorne's pride. Its urgency spoke louder than the master's calm. For men like Thorne did not rush without reason. Something unseen pressed him to command this work, something he wished hidden. The tools were brought, the bricks set in neat piles, mortar mixed thick as clay. Isaiah laid the first stones while Thorne watched from the doorway, the air tense as though secrets sat heavy upon it. Each line of brick rose steady beneath Isaiah's hands, but he knew this wall was not like the others. He felt it in the rhythm of his work, in the silence of Thorne's gaze. in the weight of every strike of trowel against stone. The other enslaved whispered about the project. Why would the master need another chamber when his house was already lined with storerooms and cellars? Some said it was for silver, others for weapons. Some thought it was meant for punishment. Isaiah let them talk. He said nothing. But his silence held the sharp edge of understanding. He saw the irony clearer than any of them. The master was ordering him to build the very walls that one day might become his own undoing. Each brick Isaiah placed felt heavier than stone. It carried with it the thought of reversal, of turning power back upon itself. The chamber grew taller, darker, a hollow waiting to be filled. To Thorne it was security. To Isaiah it was prophecy. For he knew that no man can demand walls without considering that walls may also close upon him. As the chamber took shape within the big house, Isaiah worked without pause, his face calm, his silence deep. Thorne saw only obedience in that silence, but within it Isaiah carried the seed of something greater. Each stroke of mortar was a vow unspoken, each line of brick a step closer to the future, and though the master thought himself safer with every layer rising, Isaiah knew the truth. These were not only walls of storage, they were walls of fate, waiting for the day when silence itself would speak through stone. The mortar mixed thick in the trough, heavy and gray. Isaiah stirred it with steady rhythm, his hands moving as if guided by memory rather than sight. The smell of lime and clay rose sharp in the air, clinging to his skin, and as he worked, the past rose with it. Not in words, but in echoes that had never left him. He remembered the voice of his mother, not in song but in screams that tore through the night. When men dragged her away, the sound had lived in him ever since. A wound without healing, every stroke of the trowel brought it back, sharp and clear. She was gone long before his hands grew strong enough to build walls, yet her absence pressed against every stone he touched. He remembered his brother, chains clasped tight around wrists too young to bear them, the clatter of iron louder than his cries. Taken south, sold, vanished into a distance Isaiah could never cross. He saw those chains even as he spread mortar across brick. The sound of them echoed in the scrape of steel against stone, a reminder that family could be broken apart as easily as clay is broken in the hand. He remembered hunger, not as a single day but as a constant companion. Hunger carved lines into his ribs, hollowed his belly, weighed on his steps. It made every mouthful of food a measure of survival. It burned through his muscles as he worked. Even now, as a grown man, the memory of hunger lived in his bones. Each brick felt heavier because of it. Each wall, a testament to the cost of survival. The mortar bound stone to stone, but for Isaiah it bound memory to memory. Each layer of brick was more than structure. It was record. His walls held what had been taken from him and what had been carved into him. They stood not only for shelter but as monuments of pain endured and strength unbroken. As he laid the bricks, Isaiah did not speak, he never did. But his silence was not emptiness. It was memory given weight. Every motion of his hand told a story. Every line of wall carried the voices of those who could no longer speak. He worked in silence, but the silence was alive, filled with screams, with chains, with hunger, all sealed in mortar, all waiting, all held together by the patience of a man who built more than walls, who built a testimony too solid to be erased. The thought came without thunder, without fire, without the shout of another man's voice. It came as softly as the settling of dust upon wet mortar. It came as quietly as the breath between strokes of a trowel. Isaiah bent over his work, and for the first time, his silence shifted its weight inside him. No longer only shield, no longer only burden, but something sharper, something forming with the edges of stone. The chamber rose day by day, brick stacked upon brick, the walls thick and narrow, the air inside cool and close. Isaiah traced each line with careful hands, and in the rhythm of his labor another rhythm began to grow, a rhythm of thought, not of a flight, not of running through swamp water or chasing the stars, but of something heavier, something rooted in stone. He looked at the doorway, he measured its frame, he pressed mortar into the seams, and he felt the walls closing not around himself, but around another. Around the man who gave orders with calm cruelty, around the master, whose silence mirrored not his own but twisted it into power. Isaiah's silence had always been defense, but now it began to imagine attack not with blade or flame, but with the same tools that had built the master's house. The idea lived first as a shadow at the edge of his mind. He did not name it, he did not need to. It was enough to feel it settle within him like a seed. Waiting in dark soil, he placed another brick, and the shadow grew clearer. He spread another line of mortar, and the seed took root. He saw with each rising row how walls could do more than shelter, how they could hold, how they could bind, how they could bury. Isaiah's hands moved steady as ever. His face gave nothing away. The overseers saw only obedience in his silence. The master saw only skill. Yet, beneath that stillness, a dangerous clarity was forming. He was no longer only a mason building and he was told to build. He was becoming a man who understood that stone could turn upon its owner. The thought of revenge did not burn hot. It did not rush through him like fire. It sat quiet and cold, like stone itself. It carried weight, it carried patience, it carried the promise that walls could speak without sound, that justice could be carved not in words but in silence. And in that silence Isaiah felt something awaken that he had never allowed himself to hold before, the possibility of retribution, rising as steady as the wall beneath his hands. Isaiah rose with the dawn as he always did. His steps slow and measured, his face calm, his hands steady. No word slipped from his lips. No glance lingered too long. He moved like a shadow within the light, careful not to draw it upon himself, for he knew now that his silence was not only his shield, it was his test, his trial. Each breath demanded control, each motion demanded patience. The chamber grew taller day by day, and with it the weight of his thought. Each brick was placed with precision, but each brick also carried danger. For the overseers walked near the site, watching the work with narrow eyes. The master himself passed by, often, his voice low, his questions few. Yet Isaiah felt the gaze that pressed upon him as though it could strip him bare. Suspicion was as deadly as a blade. Slaves had been whipped, broken, sold for less than a stray word, a glance too bold, a silence too heavy. So, Isaiah bound himself tighter within that silence than ever before. He let no expression break across his face. He let no sound slip from his tongue, even when others asked him small things, even when laughter passed lightly through the cabins. At night he gave nothing. He was stone. Himself, unreadable, immovable, untouchable. At times his own stillness pressed against him like a wall, closing in. The thought of revenge whispered louder now that the plan had begun to form, yet he could not allow it to show. His hands moved in rhythm, his eyes fixed upon the work, the body spoke only of duty while his heart carried the weight of a future no one could see. Others around him muttered of punishments they had seen, of men whipped for dropping, a tool of women lashed for pausing too long in the heat. These were reminders, carved into flesh, of how little it took to rouse suspicion Isaiah carried. Those reminders, like scars inside him, they steadied him. They reminded him that to hold his silence was to hold his life. Each day he returned to the chamber and laid brick upon brick, while the overseers nodded at his obedience, while the master praised his skill. He gave them no reason to doubt, no reason to question, no reason to see beyond the surface. He let them believe silence meant submission. He let them believe the silence mason was nothing more than what they had always thought. But within himself he knew the truth. His silence had become absolute. Not weakness, not fear, but design. Every gesture, measured. Every glance, guarded. Every breath. Hidden within that silence lay a power that no whip could strike free. A patience that no chain could bind, and a plan rising as steadily as the walls beneath his hands. Day by day the chamber rose higher, the walls closing in with every line of brick, the sound of stone against stone, echoing like a heartbeat in the hollow frame of the house. Isaiah worked with steady hands, mixing mortar, laying brick, smoothing seams, the rhythm of his craft so flawless that no overseer thought to question it. The room grew darker with each passing day. the small window swallowed by the thickness of new walls, until the air itself seemed to cool, heavy and damp, like breath held too long. Isaiah felt the shape of the chamber pressing against him as he worked narrow and confined, the kind of space that swallows sound and traps a man in silence. He knew every inch of it by touch, every seam, every weight, every curve of stone that would stand long after flesh had turned to dust, and he thought often of how the master never bent to look too close, never ran his hand along the new lines, never asked more than a word or two of progress. Ezekiel Thorne carried pride in his trust for the silence mason. For him, silence meant obedience, skill meant loyalty. That trust was blindness, and Isaiah knew it, and with each blind glance from the master, he felt the plan grow stronger. The thought that this room meant more than storage, more than labor. This chamber was becoming a vessel, a mouth that could close upon a man and keep him there forever. The other slaves passed by at times carrying tools or wood or water, and they saw only work. They spoke little, for silence kept them safe. Yet Isaiah wondered if any of them felt the weight that clung to these walls, the hush that seemed heavier than mortar itself. He said nothing, his eyes down, his hands moving, always working, always building. At night, when the fields lay still, he would remember the chamber, even in the dark of his sleep, the smell of wet stone, the scrape of brick, the cool air that felt already like a grave. He did not fear it. Instead, he saw in its shadow a chance, not for escape, but for justice. Carved from his very silence, the master trusted him. And that trust would one day close like these walls, narrowing tighter, colder, unbreakable. Each sunrise brought the chamber closer to completion. Each sunset left Isaiah more certain that the undoing of Ezekiel Thorne was not a dream, but a design written in mortar, written in memory, written in stone. The evening sun fell heavy across the cane fields, turning the air thick and gold as if the day itself wished to linger, but within the yard cruelty moved swifter than the light. Ezekiel Thorne stood with his cane in hand, his voice sharp as kai. Rage sharper, a boy no more than 10. Stumbled at his feet, his back marked with blood and dust. The cane cracked again and again, each strike hollow against fragile bone, the sound carrying across the quarters like a curse. The other slaves turned away. Some closed their eyes, some pressed their hands to their mouths, but none dared move, for a single step toward mercy meant chains. Or worse. Isaiah stood near the edge of the yard, a bucket in his hands, his face a grassed mask of stone. The silence he carried so long pressed against his chest until it felt like it might burst. Yet he gave no sound, no cry, no plea. His eyes fixed upon the master, his grip steady, though his heart thundered. Each strike was a line drawn in mortar, each cry of the child a brick laid into the chamber. Isaiah had been building in his mind. The room was no longer only wood and stone, it was flesh and memory, it was rage forged into silence. It was the wanting, the tomidis, the shape of justice. And now, with each breath, the thought hardened the way mortar does when the sun has baked it too long. The boy collapsed at last, barely breathing, the dust rising like smoke around him. Thorne wiped his brow as if his work were some labor of pride, his eyes cold, his voice calm as he ordered the child dragged away to live or to die without concern. Isaiah watched, not with despair but with clarity, the kind that comes when choice is no longer choice but destiny. That night the quarters whispered softly, prayers mixed with fear, the air carrying the sound of mourning, though no funeral had been given. Isaiah lay awake, staring into the dark, his hands tracing the memory of brick, his mind hearing the thud of stone, not cane. He felt the weight of silence pressing tighter than chains, yet within it a fire grew, controlled, contained, waiting. The chamber within the big house was nearly finished, the walls high, the doorway narrow, the air heavy, and still Isaiah knew then that it was no longer simply a room. It was the mouth of judgment, and soon it would close upon Ezekiel Thorne, and never open again. The air was thick with the scent of lime and earth, the chamber standing nearly complete, its walls cool to the touch, its corners sharp with silence. Isaiah moved with careful intention, each gesture practiced, each word withheld, though within him every thought pressed forward like stone ready to fall. He had measured the distance he had weighed. the space he had built. Not only a room but a snare. Ezekiel Thorne never doubted him. Not once. The master carried himself with the arrogance of one who believed stone would rise at his command and men would bow without question. Isaiah let him believe it. He worked steady, laying brick, smoothing seams. His silence, the perfect disguise, so that when he finally spoke of inspection, it carried no suspicion, only the tone of duty. "Master Thorne, the chamber stands as you asked," Isaiah said, his voice, even his face, unreadable. "You may see for yourself if it pleases you." The words fell soft yet precise, the kind that could not be mistaken for rebellion, only for obedience. Thorne adjusted his coat, the evening light glinting off the brass buckle at his waist. He strode forward without hesitation, his boots striking the wooden floor, then the cool stone as he stepped into the chamber, his eyes sweeping the walls. His lips curled in satisfaction. "This will do," he muttered, running his hand along the edge of mortar. He thought of valuables, of storage, of control, never of danger, never of what lay hidden in silence. Isaiah followed behind him, slow, deliberate, his eyes tracing the doorway, the narrow throat of the room, the weight of the bricks that had risen day after day. By his own scarred hands, the space was tighter now, with Thorne inside the air. Already still, as if waiting, as if holding its breath. The master turned his back to him, his gaze on the unfinished wall, his mind on the riches he might lock away within these stones. Isaiah watched the way pride made him careless, the way arrogance left him blind. And in that blindness, he saw the shape of his justice more clearly than ever before. The chamber had swallowed Thorne without him knowing, and all that remained was the silence to close around him, tighter and heavier than chains. The doorway narrowed as Isaiah pulled the wooden frame closed, the sound quiet yet heavy like the sigh of earth sealing itself. The chamber darkened around Ezekiel Thorne. Though he did not notice at first, he turned with a smile, thin and sharp, his voice dripping with command, thinking Isaiah was only securing the door as ordered. Isaiah bent low, his hand steady upon the trowel, the weight of mortar thick upon the blade, his silence heavier than stone itself. The first brick came to rest with a dull sound against the threshold. Isaiah pressed it firm, smoothing mortar around its edges, sealing it clean and tight. The act was small yet final. The line had been crossed. The chamber was no longer a town, place of storage. It was a grave, unspoken. Thorne chuckled at first, a dry sound echoing against the walls. He thought it some jest, some moment of misunderstanding, his arrogance too large to imagine danger from hands he believed bound by obedience. Isaiah did not lift his gaze. His arms moved with the rhythm of his craft, laying mortar, placing bricks smoothing edge upon edge, his body remembering each movement as if it were born into him. The sound of stone filled the silence, tapping, spreading, pressing tighter each breath. The master's laugh faltered, replaced by a question sharp and uncertain. "Boy, what are you doing?" His voice cut through the chamber, but Isaiah gave no answer, only the scrape of trowel against brick, only the hush of mortar filling cracks. Another brick, another line closed, the light shrinking to a thin thread. Thorne's tone rose from command to anger, his words spitting through the narrowing space. "Open this wall. Now, Isaiah, do you hear me?" The curses filled the air, heavy and harsh. Yet they slid off Isaiah's silence like rain against stone. The rhythm did not break, brick after brick, each one a memory, each one a wound sealed into place. The cries grew louder, a shout, then a roar. Fists struck the inside of the wall. The sound muffled already, as if the stone itself wished to swallow it. Isaiah worked without pause, the wall rising inch by inch, the chamber shrinking voice by voice, until only the steady scrape of mortar, the sure weight of stone remained, louder than laughter, louder than curses, stronger than cruces. Fear. The chamber pressed closer, as Isaiah laid each brick with deliberate care, with the mortar thick and cold between his fingers, the trowel moving in a rhythm perfected by years of silent labor, each motion precise, each line straight and true as the provant. Walls rose higher. Ezekiel Thorne shifted uneasily within the narrowing space. At first his voice was sharp, a command meant to bend obedience into fear. Isaiah did not respond. He continued his work with the steady certainty of water wearing. Stone. Thorne tried again with threats, his words echoing back from the walls as if they were thrown into a canyon, and returned. Twisted and empty. He threatened chains. He threatened lashes. He promised ruin and ruin again, but Isaiah only pressed mortar smooth against brick, fitting each piece, as if it were part of some terrible puzzle already solved in his mind. The sweat on his brow mingled with the dust in the air, yet his hands never faltered, never hesitated. The master's tone shifted next to bargaining. He promised comfort, he promised pardon, he offered anything. If only Isaiah would pause, if only he would stop sealing the wall with each brick. He leaned against the narrowing doorway, pressed his shoulders into the frame, as if he could push back. Time and fate. The voice grew desperate, softening into pleas, murmurs that begged for mercy. He begged for breath. He begged for life. But Isaiah's face remained impassive. His eyes lowered upon the mortar. His hands guided the trowel, as if the world itself depended on the placement of stone. Brick after brick, Isaiah raised the wall higher. The air grew tighter, the room smaller, the master's movements frantic now, yet contained by the very walls he had never thought could hold him. Ezekiel Thorne's voice broke into sobs, the sound strangled against the narrowing space like a bird caught in a trap. He tried to reason, he tried to bargain, he tried to call upon any name he thought could grant him reprieve. Yet the silence that Isaiah carried for so long filled the chamber, heavier than stone, heavier than chains, heavier than fear. The wall became more than brick, more than mortar. It became the measure of justice. It became the reversal of power. It became a mirror in which the master saw himself reflected, trapped helpless at the hands of the very man he had enslaved, about slave whose silence had been building as carefully and as relentlessly as the structure now swallowing the master inch by inch. Isaiah worked steadily, the sound of trowel against brick, the scrape and press of mortar, the solid thunk of stone. Fitting stone drowned out the pleas, and the curses filled the room with the rhythm of inevitability. Each layer laid another testament to control, another act of quiet vengeance. The chamber closed tighter around Ezekiel Thorne, the air thick with dust and fear, the walls growing stronger with every sweep of Isaiah's hands, every steady placement of stone until the last layer approached the ceiling, and the master was entirely contained by the labor of the one he had thought powerless. The final brick rested in Isaiah's hands, heavy with the weight of years of labor and memory. He measured it against the narrow gap, the last space that separated the master from the outside world. His hands did not shake, though his body trembled with the magnitude of what was to come, every motion precise, every movement deliberate. As he lifted the brick and pressed it into place, the mortar cold and sticky beneath his fingers, molding to the shape of stone and fate. Thorne's voice had become a thin thread stretched to its breaking point. He whispered, now, not in anger, not in command, but in fear. The sound swallowed by the chamber itself, as Isaiah eased the brick into its final position, a soft scrape against the edges, and then stillness. The wall closed slowly, guided by hands that had known chains and hunger, and the labor of 1,000 days of silent watching. The last gap, filled with nothing but the weight of inevitability and the mastery of quiet. Isaiah stepped back, his eyes sweeping the sealed surface. The room, now a tomb without a lid. The air heavy with dust, the smell of wet mortar, mingling with sweat and fear. He did not speak. He did not pause. His breathing, even measured and calm, as if to honor the silence that had carried him through the work. The chamber stood complete, a monument of reversal, a structure of stone and memory and justice. The master entombed not by violence of sword or whip, but by the patient, unyielding, methodical rhythm of hands, long practiced in silence. Outside the room, the plantation continued its rhythm, the sounds of chains and hammers, the rustle of sugarcane in the wind, the distant calls of men and women at work. None knew the chamber had been sealed. None could guess the soundless verdict rendered within the thick walls of stone. Isaiah's figure remained steady. He brushed mortar from his arms, checked the edges of the brick. The lines straight and true, as if confirming that the act was complete and flawless. The air outside pressed in through cracks in the windows and doors, yet the silence inside remained absolute and sovereign. Thorne's voice no longer pierced the chamber. The pleas, the bargains, the threats, extinguished by the final brick pressed into place, the master, swallowed by the very structure he had demanded, built a wall that was never meant to contain him. Alone, Isaiah moved back to the entrance, his chest rising and falling. With the slow certainty of survival and purpose, he gazed upon the walls, not with triumph or rage, but with the calm gravity of one who has witnessed the truth of power and its reversal. The air thick with history, and the scent of wet mortar bore witness to the moment when silence became a weapon, when patience became justice, and when stone remembered the hands that had built it. The last gap sealed the chamber whole, the darkness inside absolute, the master, imprisoned by the labor of his own making, and Isaiah, the silent mason, stepped back into the light outside, his work complete, his silence eternal. And for the first time, the wall he built was no longer for a master but against him. The plantation moved with its usual rhythm, the fields of sugarcane bending in the wind, the sun rising over the low horizon and casting long shadows across the yard. Yet something had shifted. A quiet tension hung over the work. The overseers walked faster, their eyes sharper, their questions more frequent, the air thick with unease. The missing master, a presence in absence that weighed on every person who labored under the hot Louisiana sun. The chains clinking, the hammers striking. The wood, the calls to line up and work, all carried a new edge. Slaves whispered among themselves, careful to keep voices low, careful to watch for ears that might listen. Rumors spread like sparks across dry brush. The master has fled. Some said the river took him. Others claimed he was dead in the night. Some feared worse, some hoped better. But no one could know for certain, their imaginations filled with the shadows of a man who had always demanded control, whose absence was now a hollow echo in the air. Overseers scoured the property, their footsteps heavy on the earth. They opened doors, they inspected sheds, they questioned men and women whose lives had been measured by obedience and fear. Yet every search ended the same way: empty rooms, locked doors, a sense of frustration that grew heavier. With each passing hour, the plantation itself seemed to hold its breath, the cane fields swaying as if to conceal some secret. The walls of the house standing tall and silent, guarding the doom truth that only one could see. Isaiah moved among them quietly, blending into the rhythm of labor. He carried water, he hauled bricks, he tended fires, all the while watching the men who searched the plantation with polite detachment, his face calm, his hands steady, his eyes always on the shadows that whispered secrets. Only he could understand the wall he had built was more than stone and mortar. It was a sanctuary. It was a tomb. It was a testament to patience and silence and the truth of what had been accomplished within its confines. Days passed and the confusion deepened. The plantation murmured with tension. The overseers grew weary, their questions sharper, their glances longer. The other slaves cast furtive looks at Isaiah. A man whose silence had always been impenetrable now seemed to hum with hidden meaning. Yet none dared speak too loudly for fear of punishment. The weight of uncertainty settled on every shoulder and moved through the air like the thick humidity that never left the fields. And through it all, Isaiah remained composed. He carried on with the tasks expected of him. The mortar mixed, the bricks placed, the fires stoked, the water carried, yet behind the steady movements, the truth waited concealed within the wall, the secret that no one else could touch. The master was gone, swallowed by the labor of his own making, and the silence that Isaiah had carried for so long bore witness to the moment when control reversed and a quiet justice was complete. The plantation continued its work, the fields bending in the wind, the sun climbing higher each day, yet the absence of Thorne became the pulse beneath every step, the whispers of men and women searching for answers, a rhythm of curiosity and the fear that could not pierce the silence, held within the brick and mortar, the truth hidden in plain sight, and Isaiah moved through it all, unbroken calm, certain that some things could only be known by the hands that built them, and the silence that carried them. The days stretched long across the plantation, the sun climbing high and falling low, the rhythm of labor constant and unyielding. Yet Isaiah moved through it alone, a man surrounded by voices yet untouched by them, his silence a shield and a chain, the work of his hands, respected by some, feared by others, but never understood the truth of what lay behind steady motions and calm eyes. He spoke to no one, not of the chamber, not of the bricks, not of the master swallowed by the wall, each word unspoken, a necessity, each glance held in careful restraint, for to confess would be to invite death to speak, would unravel the structure he had built as thoroughly as the mortar could contain stone. The secret of the chamber pressed against his chest, heavier than any load carried through the fields, heavier than the sun that beat down on his shoulders, heavier than hunger or thirst. At night he lay on his small cot listening to the plantation, breathed the whispers of the enslaved drifting through the thick air, the calls of children, and the creaking of the house settling in its frame, the silence inside him louder than any sound around him. His thoughts circling the brick walls, the closed door, the absence of Thorne. The weight of the justice executed, and the cost it demanded. He could not share the story, could not seek comfort or recognition, could not speak of the months of patience, of careful planning, of the day when the first brick sealed the fate of the master. Isolation wrapped around him as tightly as the chains once had, the laughter of others, the gossip of women, the complaints of men, all a distant echo because he could not answer, he could not acknowledge, he could not reveal the chamber where stone and mortar told a story he alone was entrusted to witness. His mind replayed each moment, the placing of bricks, the sound of the master's voice fading into panic, and then silence, the sweep of his trowel against the edges of the wall, the layering of mortar like the layering of memory into a permanent record that no one could see or touch. Yet within the isolation there was power, there was control, there was a kind of quiet triumph born not from sound but from stillness, from endurance, from understanding that the story he carried alive inside him could never be taken from him. Even if it could never be shared, the silence was a heavy price, but it was also a sanctuary, a place where justice and patience and skill converged into something eternal and complete. Each day he returned to labor with the same steady hands, the same calm expression, the same absence of words, because survival demanded it, because memory demanded it, because the world outside could never comprehend what he carried within, and though the silence was a burden, it was also proof of what he had done, proof of the reversal of power, proof of patience, resolve, and the quiet endurance that made him both prisoner and master of the truth, hidden within the walls of brick and mortar that held the master and the secret alike. Time moved across the plantation in steady, predictable rhythm. The sun rising and falling, the fields bending under the weight of sugarcane and cotton. The labor of enslaved hands constant and unrelenting, as if nothing had shifted, as if the master still walked among them. But Isaiah knew better. The wall he had built stood firm, a silent monument to what had occurred, yet invisible to the eyes that passed by every day. It rose in shadow and silence, a threshold between the past and the present, a reminder of patience and precision and a justice carried out without sound. The seasons changed, the crops grew green and heavy under the sun. They were harvested, they were burned, they were replanted, and each time the workers bent to the earth, Isaiah moved among them. Unnoticed, his face calm, his hands steady, the work continuing as it always had, yet in every motion there was a memory, the placement of brick, the layering of mortar, the careful sealing of a chamber that held the truth no one could name. The walls became a witness to what had been done, boundary between what was spoken and what was hidden. Ezekiel Thorne lingered in the chamber, not in life but in presence, not as the master who had issued orders, who had struck and threatened, but as a shadow pressed against stone, a figure trapped within the cold embrace of brick and mortar. Echoes of his voice that Isaiah had silenced now belonged to the wall itself. Every shout, every plea, every curse absorbed into the masonry until it became part of the structure, permanent and unyielding, a testament to reversal and the quiet authority of patience and skill. The other enslaved workers continued their days unaware of the chamber that held their master. The overseers passed by the walls. Without question, the house remained a monument to cruelty, yet within it there was a secret so complete that it reshaped the understanding of power. Without a single word spoken, the wall contained a story. Isaiah alone could tell, a story of justice and endurance, of planning and meticulous labor. Yet, it was a story that could never leave the chamber for matters. It was long adders of the justice and will Isaiah law. To speak, it would undo all it had accomplished. At night the plantation settled into darkness, and Isaiah moved through the fields, through the house, through the shadows, carrying the weight of memory and silence. The stars above witnessed the steady breathing of the living, the hum of insects and wind, and carried with them the quiet knowledge that the past and present could coexist in the form of stone, that the labor of a single man could turn oppression into permanence, and that even as the world continued its cycle of suffering, the wall remained unyielding. Through heat and rain, through frost and wind, the wall remained a presence steady and eternal, a reminder that justice need not be loud, that the hands that built could also defend, that patience and silence could overturn cruelty, and that the past, though buried in brick, could persist unseen, shaping the plantation, shaping the lives of those within it, shaping the understanding of power itself. Isaiah moved through the plantation, as the years passed, a quiet figure among many hands. Bending to the sun, a man who carried more than bricks. He carried memory. He carried intent. He carried the weight of a choice that could never be spoken. Aloud yet resonated in every motion he made. The wall he built remained a constant in the landscape, its presence unnoticed by those who passed it every day, yet impossible to erase for those who understood the work it represented, knew that the act of construction had become an act of defiance, and that the mortar and stone held a story that no overseer, no master, no law could take away. He walked among the fields, and through the quarters, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. The life of the plantation continued with its rhythms of labor and oppression, the work relentless, the masters ever present in new forms, the cycle unchanged. Yet Isaiah carried within him a quiet power, a knowledge that a single mind, a single pair of hands, could alter the terms of authority without raising a voice, without calling for arms, simply by doing what he had always done, by building, by measuring, by placing each brick with patience and precision. The enslaved continued their days unaware of the chamber that held the man who had once ruled over them. The house remained a symbol of wealth and cruelty, yet within its walls existed a counterweight, a truth encoded in brick and mortar, a legacy that transcended words, that transcended time, a reminder that control is not absolute, that even those deemed powerless can leave a mark that will endure beyond the reach of chains and whips. Isaiah's silence became a language of its own, a language of resilience and strategy, a testament to what can be accomplished when one understands the power of patience, when one knows the strength of careful calculation, when one sees the world not only as it is, but as it could be reshaped through deliberate, invisible acts. The wall stood as proof of his vision, proof that the enslaved could craft consequence, that justice could exist in forms other than immediate retribution, that history could be rewritten in subtle, enduring ways. Even as new masters came and the plantation changed hands, even as years turned into decades, the wall remained intact, a monument to what had occurred, a reminder of the courage and intellect of a man who understood the weight of silence and the permanence of stone. Isaiah did not live to see freedom for his people, nor did he escape the bounds of his condition. Yet through his work he left a message to the world that power is not always loud, that resistance can take forms beyond the obvious, that even in oppression the mind and hands of the resolute can craft a legacy that speaks across generations. And so the plantation continued its cycles, yet beneath the surface of routine and suffering, beneath the everyday cruelty, beneath the eyes that saw only labor, the wall remained eternal. A monument to the quiet authority of Isaiah, the silence mason, a legacy of courage and careful craft. A truth that would outlast masters in chains and whisper across the centuries that even the silent, even the enslaved, can build walls that speak louder than words.